Okay, well, my brief is to talk about school admissions, particularly for disadvantaged families. And there's been a clear effort by recent governments to tackle what are seen as unfair admissions practices. Concerns came to the fore before the election of the Labour government in 1997, and changes have been made to legislation and policy since then. Now, school admissions are entry to school. My focus is on entry to primary school and entry to secondary school, although my focus is going to be on secondary school admissions. School admissions are coordinated by local authorities. There's statutory guidance regarding the admissions process with the school admissions code, and there's also an office of the school's adjudicator. And these resolve differences over the interpretation and application of legislation and guidance on admissions, and they make determinations that are legally binding. There's a broad political consensus about the need for admissions to be fair. The 2010 Coalition White Paper, The Importance of Teaching, talks about ensuring a level playing field on admissions. I'm going to talk a little about research we've carried out at the LSE, supported by the Sutton Trust, the Research and Information on State Education Trust, the Esme Fairbairn Foundation, and the Greater London Authority. I'm going to talk a little bit about changes over time. And I'm going to focus on three distinct issues: compliance, control over admissions, and complexity. So the first one is compliance. And recent research has found there is now a high level of compliance as far as the use of admissions criteria is concerned. The use of covert or social selection via interviews and prioritising family members is no longer apparent in published admissions criteria. And I say no longer apparent in published criteria because, of course, one doesn't know what actually goes on in practice. Our work for the Sutton Trust and our current LSE-funded research on secondary school admissions in London shows that all schools are giving top priority to children in the care of local authority, what we call looked after children. More schools now mention children with statements of special educational needs, now education, health and care plans, in their admissions criteria, signalling to parents that children with such needs are welcomed, unlike those that make no reference to such children. More schools are now using banding, a way of allocating children to schools based on different levels of ability, and random allocation across an area or zone are being used by more schools to gain, or try and gain, a more socially mixed intake. This doesn't necessarily mean that disadvantaged children will benefit individually, but a socially mixed intake is more likely than one that's predominantly disadvantaged to benefit children attending the school. More schools are also selecting a proportion of children on the basis of aptitude in a subject area. This is allowed by law and in the school admissions code. And this is more likely to benefit children from more advantaged backgrounds, but could also result in a more socially mixed intake. So I'm now moving on to control over admissions. Previous research has demonstrated that some schools that are responsible for their own admissions, especially those with a religious character, there's no church-state divide in England as there is in the States, that these schools that are responsible for their own admissions have more advantaged intakes, and the reasons are not straightforward. But it is the case that more schools are now responsible for admissions than was the case previously as a result of the increased numbers of academies. So academies and newly set up academies or free schools are responsible for their own admissions, along with religious voluntary aided schools and foundation schools too. And our work in London, where the market is most highly developed, has found that the proportion of schools that are responsible for their own admissions has increased massively over time. So now, nearly 8 out of 10 secondary schools in London control their own admissions, compared with 44% in 2001. So the fact that these decisions are made at school level remains problematic. As I said before, it's not possible to know what goes on behind closed doors. So the third issue I'd like to talk about briefly is complexity. Admissions arrangements should be clear, fair and objective. That's stated in all the statutory guidance, whilst many are, particularly for community schools, some are not. A major problem with the expansion of schools responsible for admissions is that the process is even more complex. And this has been raised in the past by our own research for the Sutton Trust and for others, and by the Chief Schools Adjudicator. I'm just going to give a few examples. So some religious schools, voluntary aided schools and academies have very complex admissions criteria. One example we highlight in some research that we're currently carrying out is an admissions policy of one academy with a religious character, and that's 12 pages long. So this is not necessarily terribly straightforward for all parents. In our Sutton Trust research, we found that around a third of voluntary aided secondary schools in England had between 7 and 16 religious criteria. The actual arrangements may be unnecessarily complex across an area. A banding, which I can't go into the details of how it works in practice, but it is designed to achieve an academically mixed intake to schools, but it requires children to be tested. In some local authorities, the testing is organised in school time, and the results are used across all schools that use this particular mechanism. However, a more common pattern is for children to have to take different tests on several different days, including weekends, making it difficult for parents who have atypical working patterns, shift work, for example, weekend working, and causing additional stress for children. We found in one London local authority with 17 secondary schools, 6 have almost identical criteria. 4 Roman Catholic schools have a whole range of different criteria, and of the remaining academies, some have inner and outer catchment areas with equal bands. Some have 9 ability bands, some have 2 equal bands, and one has 3 bands. So again, it seems to be unnecessarily complex, with the goal being a similar goal across all the schools. And although random allocation across an area can be used to achieve a more balanced intake, the admissions process can be very complex, with these different zones and banding combined. And other examples, just very briefly before I finish, include different types of places, some for children who have got religious affiliation and some who don't, being used along with a points system, so you get additional points for this, that, and the other. Banding, selection also by aptitude in a subject area. And then there's one example we discovered of complex nodal points being used for measuring distance, which might well be might have a very clear objective in trying to actually make sure that children in a particular area have access, but it's difficult for parents to understand what's going on. It's not invariably this complex. So in one local authority, for example, academies have the same criteria as community schools. Yes. So I shall end there.
Thank you very much.